Okay, thank you all very much and welcome to PA 509, Applied Political Economy. This is class 4, and tonight we're going to be getting into social dilemmas. This is part 1 of our discussion in social dilemmas, and we'll be focusing on externalities, which I will tell you in my experience with public policy work over the last 25 years, that's probably one of the most important things that you can learn about. I know there was a lot of algebraic representation of the concept of externalities in this chapter. You don't need to worry about knowing that, just like I've said about other things. When it comes to those formulas and such, there's really no need to understand that. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Is everybody good? Is everybody able to hear me? Just go ahead and enter into the chat if you're able to hear me. Okay. And I'll just good. And I apologize if there's any background noise. My internet was not working well at home, so I had to maneuver to another location. So even though my headset's pretty good about not catching background noise, you may hear a little bit throughout the course of the evening, and I do apologize for that. So hopefully we will be done with class tonight around 8 o'clock. The first thing that I'd like to do is have a discussion of podcast 1, which was about inflation, and get your thoughts on that. And I appreciate everybody for turning in their assignments with respect to the questions that I asked you in regards to podcast 1. I felt like it was important that I give you all a chance to see an introduction about inflation. Don't expect you to agree with the comments that were made by the commentators during the discussion, but I feel like it's some important information to go over, to look about the different perspectives that people have about the current issues we're having with inflation in our overall economy. And then we're going to get into the discussion of the assigned reading, and we'll first talk with respect to chapter 4 on externalities. And I thought that the discussion of externalities tied into an additional reading that I sent you all out, that was a polling summary produced by Monmouth, which was polling with respect to public sentiments on COVID. And I wanted to get your thoughts with that as well. We may have time for a class exercise. We'll see how things go. And then we will close out by reviewing the week 5 assignments, which includes your first course reading and lecture assignment, which we'll be doing next week. And that should be sent out first thing tomorrow morning. Are there any questions at this point? Okay, let's move on. So this is the first part of our discussion in social dilemmas. So what would be great is if someone could share with me what they, based on the reading, they define to be a social dilemma. That's part 1. That's kind of, the start of part 2, which, if I'm correct, is on page 97 of the text. Anybody want to share with me a definition for social dilemma? And I would prefer if you do it by audio.
It's a decision in which our individual interests clashes with the greater long-term interests of everyone.
Excellent, absolutely. When we talk about, a lot of public policy is tied to these challenges that we have where individual interests clash with collective interests. Going back to what I've talked about, even going back to the concepts of our general American principles of individual freedom and the discussions we had about different philosophies in terms of that, there is the reality that even if people pursue their individual freedom, there's the potential for individual freedoms to clash. And that is especially true when you're dealing with larger groups of society than the individual. If everybody is living on their own 100 acres somewhere out in the middle of nowhere, the potential for clashing of those personal and collective differences in terms of values or goals or objectives is fairly minimal. They do happen, but they're fairly minimal. However, as society naturally, as human beings, we naturally, even though I personally believe that we are in some ways naturally introverted, we prefer to be together. and society and we as people seem to work better when we are connected to one another. And we certainly can accomplish a lot more when we're connected together. There's a magnifying effect associated with collective action, whether it be private or public. But what that means is that there's going to be these competing values with respect to public and private, I'm sorry, personal or individual goals and collective goals. And the challenge that we have comes down to trying to achieve this status of equilibrium, which is when we try to, and you can look at equilibrium in a lot of different ways, but anybody want to share with them a kind of more economic definition of equilibrium?
So it's kind of like everyone's sort of happy with the choices that they and everyone else are making, or sort of like everyone can be at least satisfied or not pissed off.
Exactly. And how often does that happen?
Not a lot.
No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. It's a hard state to achieve. And in economics, the pursuit is always for equilibrium or optimal circumstances that are above equilibrium, but typically the pursuit is always for equilibrium. And with policy and in this discussion, what we deal with are a lot of cases where you're not able to achieve equilibrium. And that's a lot of what the author is talking about in respect to the book. And a lot of that's driven the fact that as we now shift into chapter 4, there is the reality that public policy is designed to solve a problem. It's designed to create a solution to a problem. And if you've taken public policy analysis, we kind of covered that back in the fall, or you took it in prior semester. When you take public policy analysis, for those of you who haven't taken it yet, in the summer or later on, that is something that'll be covered about what is public policy. Well, public policy is trying to solve a public problem. And the reality is that for every solution or for every policy that is out there, there tends to be intended consequences, which we deal with that are known, but there's also a lot of unintended consequences or unintended results. And that's what we refer to as externalities. And typically we'd see that there are two types of externalities. So someone want to describe to me what a positive externality is?
This long ago. It's when
Sure.
a person's actions directly affects, I guess, in a positive way, the welfare of another person or group of people.
Right, absolutely. And that the positive externality is an unintended consequence that is a benefit. And so contradictory, a negative externality would be where it is harmful. And there are several examples that are provided in this book. He spends a lot of time talking about with respect to vaccines, about the positive and negative externalities with respect to vaccines. And that can be a challenge in itself. And this book was written several years ago, but of course it's very appropriate as we're dealing with the current situation with COVID. And what he also gets into is this idea that when we're looking at trying to achieve collective goods or collective results, there is a need for, desirably there is a need for individuals to internalize the impact of these externalities, to understand the value of these externalities themselves, so that ideally when we are able to pursue collective action, we are able to pursue it in a way where we can try to achieve the greatest collective result. In reality, are these externalities internalized? Do individuals internalize externalities?
No, they don't.
So kind of give some explanation of that.
So going off of the reading, the way I took it as, like, for example, it's like going to the gym. When you go to the gym, you take away space and equipment from other people, but then you internalize the benefits of going to the gym for yourself. So by going to the gym, you have unintended consequences of like taking up space and taking up equipment, but it benefits yourself in the long run.
Right. You're concerned about the availability of space for yourself, not necessarily the
Yes,
availability
for
of
the
space
whole
for
greater
others.
good.
And that's why I go to the gym at 10, so that not only do I have space for myself, but there's nobody else there. At least that's my goal. So the reality is that human beings are naturally selfish. That's a natural element of human nature. And personally, that's why I believe we have faith, because faith is there to try, regardless of the faith that you may believe in, faith is there to attempt to serve as a balance or correction on the intrinsic qualities of human nature, selfishness being one of them. And of course, if you're not of faith, of any particular faith, there are other ways you can justify that. So this is just my opinion. But the reality is that we are naturally selfish individuals. Naturally, individuals are selfish. It's an element of human nature. And as a result, when we are faced with a situation, we're only looking at how it benefits or affects ourselves. We're not necessarily looking at how it benefits or affects others. And we're especially not looking at how it benefits or affects society as a whole. And that can be a huge challenge. So excellent discussion so far. Are there any questions with respect to what we've covered so far? Okay. So now let's talk a little bit more about collective action. So much of what we do in public policy is in the attempt to try to achieve collective action. And this can be formally through government or informally through other means. And what we're really doing is trying to achieve a particular outcome, to solve a problem or create a benefit. And there is an aspect of it where there is the reality that there is going to be personal cost incurred with respect to that action. So it's not just that. So people have to weigh their personal cost with respect to the value of the group outcome. What's an example of that?
And if we talk about like climate change, me taking a very long bus trip or a car trip back home with my parents in New York is probably screwing the climate more than it's individually benefiting me. But I don't take that into account, obviously.
Well, and there can be different arguments in terms of whether it does or doesn't, but you're absolutely right. So you could always take one of those Chinatown buses to get up to New York if you really wanted to. So there's different ways of looking at it, but you're absolutely right in that the group outcome, that there are things that we do at an individual level that create group cost or society, and it gets to that second point about individual cost and benefits versus societal benefits, in that there are certainly things that we do that have minimal individual cost but great benefit, but at the same time they may not necessarily benefit society. There are certain externalities created by society, and that is definitely the truth with personal action. So to try to better evaluate this from a quantitative perspective, the author talks with respect to this concept of the probability of success and probability of success in collective action. And this is an effort to try to quantify. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but this is the idea that in collective action, that there is a need, to the best of our ability. And the reality is, I will tell you, in the practitioner world, this is never done in a mathematical sense, except through traditional cost benefit analysis, which you'll discuss in policy analysis. We're not going to cover that here. So, but there is a way to evaluate it. And what I encourage you to do in terms of looking at the reading as you move forward professionally is examine kind of the concepts and the components of the equation and see how they would necessarily apply in a more narrative sense, not looking at it algebraically, not looking at it not looking at it purely on the basis of numbers, but thinking about the probability, because those factors contribute to the probability of success. Does anybody want to kind of explain the probability of success in a kind of more narrative concept? Anyone?
I can try it.
Sure, absolutely.
So based off of what I got from the reading, I thought his example of like a protest was a really good way to illustrate it in like a non-mathematical sense. But he basically said that like, depending on how the community backs that protest or the community participates, basically shows how successful that protest is going to be.
Right. And so the idea being is that, of course, not all social actions are necessarily supported equally. And a lot of that not only deals with the participation of society within those actions, but also deals with how many people within society participate. And so, but also how they're received by the public. When you look at the probability of success, what are the kind of issues that are out there that are likely to yield greater success than others? What are particularly when it comes to current issues, what's likely to generate more success than others?
Could it just be like topics that people feel very strongly about one way or another?
Right, definitely those issues. Of course, it can create polarization, but it certainly can create, but it definitely creates a stronger feeling of success with that group in which you are connected with. And as we talked about, on a lot of issues, there's a greater degree of polarization that exists. So it can definitely get greater support. And if you have the support of overall, and that support, particularly if it aligns with political interest, if it aligns with other interests, can lead to actual action with respect to policy. Anything else? So we get into this issue that kind of ties, okay, so then we have probability of success, and I'm going to pull my reading here and go to page 104. With respect to this concept known as the social dilemma, and where we're really trying to create value with respect to trying to show the value of this type of collective action. And the author's argument is there's a lot more I think his argument could be construed, there's a lot greater opportunities for collective action if people would take advantage of them. And I've personally seen collective action have result in policy, both positively and negatively. And that's always the challenge with respect to collective action is not always guaranteed to yield positive results. And history definitely shows us that, but I've also seen it achieve positive results. So it is something to think about, but this is all, of course, deal on achieving these optimal results, which we recognize is not necessarily possible. Does anybody want to describe for me or give me their kind of explanation or overall understanding of what the social dilemma is? Anybody?
Specifically related to his example with the $10 million, you mean?
Yes, or anything else if you want to use.
Well, so his example, if the cost to each person needs to be less than 10 cents, even though the benefit would be $1 million if the full thing were to be realized. But then he goes through an alternate version of the example showing everyone contributing more than they would need to, and it ends with the total society creating value that is, what is that, like 9,000 times the amount that the original plan was for. So he's kind of demonstrating that if everyone actually goes in, then the results can be exponential compared to what the original plan was. It just depends on how much effort or time or whatever the cost is that people are willing to put in.
Okay, so Morgan, I want to lean on you for a little bit. And of course, you work in the housing space. Kind of describe to me what you think would be an example of how this could be achieved in necessarily in your work with affordable housing.
So I think you might, I'm not in affordable housing, but I can
Okay,
come
I'm
up
sorry.
with,
I apologize. I thought
no, I
you
know
were,
there's other people in the class that are.
okay, I'm sorry.
But I think like
But give
one
me an example, give me a policy example from somewhere. I'm sorry for that.
that's fine. My knowledge is in the engineering world. So
Okay,
the
that's great.
example that I could think of would be sort of a public transportation example where
Great.
if everyone is willing to let their commute take 20 more minutes than it normally would and use public transportation rather than utilize a personal vehicle every day, then theoretically society would be able to cut down on the number of parking lots. There would be fewer emissions. We could have more walkable neighborhoods and workable spaces so that there was cleaner air and more plants and parks and green space and potentially even more urban farming. And it can go off into the great blue beyond if you're willing to take the chance, I guess, that everyone is going to be willing to take on more of the cost than would make sense for them on an individual level.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. So that leads us to ask the question. Obviously, we're talking about desirable outcomes and desirable participation, but is it necessarily desirable to have this type of socially optimal participation? Because we're mainly talking about pretty much unanimous participation or a high percentage of participation such that those who would choose not to participate would be fairly low. In terms of optimability, is optimal participation desirable? That's a question I want us to think about. What are some people's thoughts on that?
I was gonna say, I think it depends on what the situation is, right? Like,
Right.
because I'm thinking like even for the example of like everyone using public transportation, while there are so many positive outcomes, you also then have this issue of, well, there's gonna be a need for more public transportation, or is everyone using the same mode of transportation? Is that going to cause potential issues as well? So I guess it would be situational depending on what you needed, what you wanted it for.
Okay, excellent. And as we talked about in terms of, I mean, again, optimal participation is highly unlikely, particularly in a free society, because even though economists like to model everything based on rational behavior, we know that people don't necessarily participate rationally. Whether it's a small group of people or the majority of people don't necessarily participate rationally, given the choices there. Then there's also those who we constitute as being free riders. Somebody want to give me a definition with respect to that? What is a free rider?
Somebody who uses a resource and isn't paying their fair share for it, like public radio or something like that.
Excellent example, right? You know, this is probably a little old for some of you, but there's the episode of The Simpsons where they where Homer decides to call in and give a donation to PBS, and they kind of show up like the Goon Squad and try to demand he pay his pledge pretty quickly because he was wanting the tote bag. That's a kind of antiquated example, but there's plenty of examples out there of free riders, and this is a common issue in public policy because you pretty much have to accept in reality that there are going to be people who are going to receive the benefits of various programs or policies that you have in place and are not necessarily going to be contributors for it. At the local level, I'll give you the best example. Parks are generally public access. There's no restriction on who can necessarily access parks. But at the same time, you have people who may come in from other areas who will use the park, who are not necessarily part of your jurisdiction, who are then subsequently benefiting from the park, but are not necessarily contributing any funds to it. And parks, for the most part, there are some state and federal grant programs, but parks, for the most part, are locally funded by jurisdictions. So there's no control of that. What they do try to do with respect to programs a lot of times at the local level is they will assess different fee structures for both those who are residents within a given jurisdiction that's providing a program like a sports league or a particular cultural arts class, but then they will apply a non-resident fee for those who want to take advantage of it who aren't tax-paying members of the community. This was especially a situation when it came to annexation here in North Carolina. Up until about, trying to think here, up to about 11, 12 years ago, the concept of annexation in North Carolina was rather progressive in terms that state leaders believed that if you lived in a developed area, whether it be a suburb or any type of area that was being built up, that area should be part of a municipality. It should not just simply be in an unincorporated area outside of a municipality. And this was a significant departure from where things were before. From that, so the belief was so that as these areas outside of cities became developed, as you saw urban expansion or suburban sprawl occur, that the neighboring jurisdictions would be able to annex these areas involuntarily. And the reason why, in part, was to address the free rider problem, that whether it be the road system or whether it be other public services, the residents of these areas, while they may not necessarily be living in these communities explicitly, were benefiting from the services that were being provided. So what happened was people naturally, under an optimal situation, people would understand that and would accept that and would accept that the externality to them is that they got to pay city taxes. They may have to sign up for certain utilities, and they may have to be under certain city ordinances, like how many dogs they can have in their yard or something like that. But what happened was that there were people who disagreed with it and were not willing to cooperate, and they were able to get the legislature to change laws that invalidated involuntary annexation. So now North Carolina has an annexation process like most other states, where if you want to annex the property, the people who are being annexed have to allow for that through petition or referendum. Of course, what that does is that it expands the free rider problem, because these individuals may be living in neighborhoods that don't have parks or pools or other social infrastructure. And when they want to use those resources, they're coming into your community to use them, and they're basically not necessarily directly contributing. They may argue, well, we're contributing to the sales tax we spend in local stores or other things, but they're not directly contributing through through property tax or other means. So that is something that we have to think about. Does anybody have any other examples they would like to contribute with respect to kind of examples that they've experienced with free riders? Okay.
Oh, I did have one. I was
Sure,
thinking
absolutely. Go ahead.
I was thinking of when everyone received a stimulus check, whether you were rich or not. So there were definitely people who received them that achieved a benefit in their lives that may have been bigger than others. Like some people didn't necessarily need them, but still received them.
That's true. And that was one of the challenges with the concept that was being applied, was the idea of are we really distributing this benefit in a way, especially in the first couple of rounds of stimulus, in that people were getting them just on the basis of existence and they didn't necessarily need the money. And of course, there's no guarantee about how people would use the money itself. Now, of course, the thing to remember is that at the end of the day, the stimulus check is technically a tax credit. So it's an advanced tax credit. You receive the money up front and you don't have to pay it back. But if you do receive the tax credit in advance, when you pay your taxes, you have to not accept the tax credit. So depending on what people were paying in terms of taxes, the benefits can vary differently. But that is a good example because there's a lot of people that could necessarily benefit from that or not benefit from it as much, but who necessarily weren't terribly in, who weren't, it benefited people differently based on their income levels. And they've tried to address that to some degree with what we did in the second half of 2021 with the child tax credit. So let's talk about public goods. So I'm sorry, Karen.
Oh, I was just going to offer another example, but we
Sure.
probably move on. Well, I mean, no pun intended, but even with our road system, there are free riders. If a neighborhood has private roads and someone uses it as a cut through to shorten their commute, they're a free rider. If they come into, a county or a state road, as they vacation or whatever, even our beaches have that trouble. They're trying to maintain a lot of resources, be it the beaches themselves or the road system to get you there, and yet it's benefiting people who aren't the taxpayers to support those resources.
Absolutely, that's a good example, and I think Ian gives a good example in his text. These concept, these gathering sites like Wikipedia. Wikipedia comes out very regularly and asks for money, particularly towards the end of each year. And a lot of people use Wikipedia. In fact, there's a ton of people that use it. It's one of the challenges we have in academia, and not a lot of people contribute to it. Wikipedia itself is a very interesting concept in terms of how it is managed to use the power of crowdsourcing to be able to provide this insanely expansive database of information, basically be our modern encyclopedia for those of us who remember actual book encyclopedias and remember having them in our houses or our schools. I actually collect encyclopedias, which I know makes me a little weird, but I always enjoy it because I always like to see how the past interpreted information, because one of the things about encyclopedias is they do change over time as information, as our understanding of history change. So, okay, good. Thank you, Melissa. I appreciate that. I've got about 3 sets now, and the challenge is, of course, finding a place to put them. So that's the challenge. But so let's talk more a little bit about public goods. And the key things to understand about public goods, and I believe that that's on page 105, is that there's really 2 qualities when we're talking about a public good, and this should not be confused with the public good. The 2 qualities that associate with the public good is, first of all, that it's non-excludable. What does it mean by when we say that something is non-excludable?
Literally nobody can be excluded from the good. Like, it's something that everybody has access to, and there's not, like, nobody can be excluded from access to it. Like,
right, like the ocean would be an excellent example. You can't exclude people. You can't exclude people from the ocean. So that's definitely one to think about. And so next we have the concept that a public good is non-rival. What do we mean by non-rival?
My use of it doesn't take away your use of it as well.
Sorry, go ahead, Curtis. Say that again, Curtis.
That means that my using it doesn't reduce your access to it as well. We both have equal access and usage. It's not going to
correct
how much I use.
Absolutely. So that's a good point. So these are exclusive and relatively indefinite. And so what I want to do is I'm actually teaching another class right now and I want to show you something from the textbook for that class, because we covered public goods this week. And I want to show you a little example here, if everybody can see it. And what basically the author of this text says is that public goods are what they call non-appropriable. And what, again, it means is that we're talking about items that are non-excludable and non-rival. And as you can see in the bottom right of this matrix, we're talking about pure public goods. And so some good examples of that are national defense, our system of laws, Vector control, which if you don't know what vector control is, that's the controlling of mosquitoes or other varmints or remnant that may be out there. And then directly diagonal to it, when we talk about excludable and rival, we're talking about pure private goods. Those are like food, basically anything that's manufactured or produced directly, like food, clothing, and television sets. It's excludable, which means it has a certain degree of limitation, or it's exhaustible in terms of quality. We will talk a little bit later about non-excludable rival goods, which are also known as commons, or in this case, common property. And when we think of fisheries or fishing ponds, aquifers, or petroleum reserves, that's an example. And we'll talk a little bit about that when we get to the tragedy of the commons. And then lastly, when you have excludable non-rival goods, those are what we refer to as toll goods. So again, they're non-rival, but they are excludable. And sometimes this gets into the public space because obviously governments operate tolls. They may operate utility systems. They may operate other types of enterprises. And those are cases where there's a toll or a fee assessed to it, including satellite broadcast or broadband now, as the case may be. I think satellite's kind of going on its way out, but also things like concerts as well would be an example of that too. Even though I'm not sure about concerts, because I know there's a lot of people who prefer to sit at the front of a concert as opposed to the back of the concert, even though I'm one of those people that prefers to sit to the middle of the back of the concert. My wife, on the other hand, likes to sit at the front. So that's just something to keep in mind. Let's go back to the slide. So when it comes to public goods, we start getting to this issue of interest in terms of how public goods are defined and how public goods are developed and managed. And there's an interesting discussion that he has, and it's on page 109 with respect to what he refers to as diffuse and concentrated interest. What's the example of, what do we mean when we define a diffuse interest?
A diffuse interest it's kind of when an individual's contribution is less tangible. It's hard to see how your interest or how your participation contributes to it.
Okay, so it's a little less organized, and there's a little less cohesion. What do we mean by concentrated interest?
Concentrated interest is when you have a select group of people that are very, very motivated by whatever's going on or whatever that particular topic is.
And does it necessarily mean that diffuse and concentrated necessarily represent, is it consistent that diffuse represents minorities and concentrated it represents majorities? Is that consistent? The answer is no, not necessarily. It just means that because you could have a majority diffuse interest where people don't necessarily are able to link up, or because they may interpret it differently, or they may value it at different levels. Whereas in concentrated interest, they can often represent minority interest or majority interest, but they represent a concentrated, there's a value, there's a definite understanding of value. And he talks about this in extensive detail, starting on pages 110 to 111, and even but basically 110 to 112, talking about the interstate highway system. And he actually gives an example from my birthplace of Nashville, and I'm familiar with the example that he gives on Interstate 40. What are some of the things he talks about in terms of this example with the interstate highway system?
Oftentimes they're put through lower income areas because they tend to be more diffused with their approach to the issue.
Right, And what happened with those areas?
I'm sorry, when they continued to put it in, the areas actually declined even further.
Right, because they basically they basically drove through those areas, demolished a lot of neighborhoods, cut through neighborhoods, and basically did a lot of things that did nothing to serve those areas. And when you look at the example that he's giving, it's not necessarily that even a majority of Americans understood, or majority of people who live in these areas understood what was going on. In most of these cases, this was a case of, for the purposes of this discussion, the purposes of looking at the groups, that the concentrated interests were more representative of a very small minority of people, including road builders, including various developers and such, that were looking to shape and engineer the way that these cities and these connectivity, not only the connectivity to the suburbs, which they were developing, but also the relationship that these neighborhoods would have with the adjoining areas in the closer to the central city. And they were the ones who had concentrated interest. They had access to power, whereas the neighbors who lived in these communities that were getting split up or run over were relatively diffused. This was not a focal point. This was, when you look at the civil rights discussions of the 50s and the 60s, you don't see a lot of discussion with respect to this area. So this was something that had to be thought of. And he does go into a lot of good detail about this. I think it's a good example and definitely something to consider. So now let's go back to what I had talked about with respect to commons and the concept of common goods, also known as common property. And again, we're talking about circumstances where the particular good is non-excludable, but it is rival, which means that there's kind of a finite nature to it. And of course, the most common one we think of is water. He uses space, access to space is the case in the author's example. And this kind of gets into this concept known as the tragedy of the commons. And again, he's talking mainly about space and low orbit satellites. What do we know of as the tragedy of the commons?
Isn't it that it's a British economic phenomenon, but basically Hardin basically said that if people had access to a common area, so he used a pasture in his, he would say that if everybody had access with their cows or their animals, that the pasture would be overgrazed because people would not use the resource sustainably, and we would run out, because he doesn't feel like social institutions would protect the common property.
Excellent. And Bree also gives a good example when a good general description, when people use a shared resource, and in doing so they deplete that resource and lessen what is available for others to use. And that can be applied to pasture, it can be applied to water rights, access to fishing. Someone gave fishing ponds earlier. When we look at fishing ponds are it's not just the access to the water, it's the access to the fish. And there's only a definite supply of fish in a given location at any given time. Now that population may regenerate. Hopefully it does. There's some concerns, of course, obviously about physics, about exhaustion of those populations, particularly in coastal areas. But that's a good point. I wanted to get to and talk a little bit about, as I was looking at an example, the question about, one example that may be interesting to use is the recent gas shortages. Or it's been a little while. It's been about 9 or 10 months now since we had that. I remember when we had that. And it's interesting how public policy kind of created that tragedy of the common situation, because, that information got out in the public, and it kind of gets to some of the talk about policy interventions as we go forward. So it can kind of go into that. But does anybody know what happened when it was discovered, what the governor did when it was discovered that we were having these pipeline disruptions, which led to the potential for a gasoline shortage here in North Carolina. What action did the governor take? Okay. So what he did was he actually declared he made a disaster declaration. And so he declared a disaster declaration early on. And what that did was it actually implemented a policy that the state of North Carolina has with respect to these types of situations, where it enacts what are known as anti-price gouging laws, anti-price gouging standards. And what that does is that it really prohibits the gasoline stations from being able to decide how, if they can adjust the price of gasoline to make sure that they can maintain supply. Now, not all gas stations do that anyway. Some prefer to leave it at the existing price and just run out. But many gas stations prefer to increase their costs associated with demand so that they can level off and maintain some degree of supply in stock. But the problem is when you have an anti-gouging law, when you have a prohibition on price gouging in place, it basically takes away that lever that the gas station owner has with respect to how they can adjust the price. At the same time, when you put in place a disaster declaration, what you do is you automatically create a sense of scarcity in the public overall. And I can remember on the night that this became a news item, I drove to a gas station and I thought I was early on. I thought I was kind of towards the beginning of this to go ahead and fill up the tanks in my car. And I get to the gas station and there's a woman there who's not only filling up her tank, but is filling up her 2 5-gallon portable tanks. And so this can be a challenge as well. And certainly that creates a tragedy of the common situation. And it's kind of encouraged to some degree, that's kind of influenced to a certain extent by the public policy that's put in place to respond to it, the intervention that's attempted. Because I mean, and the issue with price gouging is kind of complex, but that's the challenge that we have. We're gonna read Leo's response here in the chat for just a second. Leo, I think that's an excellent explanation, and I thank you for sharing it. If y'all want to read it in the chat feature, in the chat section. So then we come to policy intervention. And when we talk about policy intervention, we're really talking about different ways that we can try to facilitate trying to maintain and develop public goods. Okay, Tina asked, before we get to that, Tira asked a good question. Would the instance with the gas be considered a free rider? That's an interesting question. Does anybody want to comment on that? What is anybody else's thoughts on it? I honestly don't have a thought on it at this moment, but does anybody else have their own thought on that? Would the instance with the limited gas supply be considered a free rider problem?
I kind of think it depends. Like if there was a limitation set on like how many gallons someone could get and she was violating that, then I think it's a little bit different than a free rider. Then it's like she's literally breaking the rules. But if there's only so much gas and each person is just expected to only take what they need, then yeah, I could see that being a free rider problem because she's using up a resource and not leaving any for anyone else.
Whoever was wanting to speak, go ahead and speak.
I unmuted myself by accident, but
that's okay.
I was going to say though, I was thinking though, I guess it could be too, like I remember when there was the gas shortage issue and I was in Chapel Hill, I noticed people coming from other counties, to come over to areas where there was actually still gas, right? So I think that could be similar, right? Because people within the area who actually probably needed to get gas, couldn't because people were coming from other areas to take advantage of the fact that there was still gas in those areas.
I can understand that. And at the same time, the question is, how much does the government control that, or how much does the government have a role in that? But you're right, that can create free rider situations. So that is something to think about. So I think those are two good examples. And as Catherine pointed out, the same thing definitely happened with vaccines. There were people that went, there are people who went to many different areas of this. I mean, there were people here locally, because Nash County and Edgecombe County didn't exactly get the same supplies of vaccines in other areas did. But when people wanted to get vaccinated for COVID, they went to a variety of different areas to go get vaccinated, including out of the area. Like when my wife and daughter decided to get vaccinated, they actually went to Raleigh for it. So let's talk about policy interventions. And obviously the easiest and the most ideal policy intervention that's out there. Thank you, Leo, for that. Geez, going up to Roanoke Rapids. That's a little bit of a trip. That's a little bit of a trip. So let's talk about policy interventions. And the first one we want to talk about is persuasion. Obviously, ideally, if we could, we would try to persuade people. And when we mean persuasion, obviously it's non-coercive. You try to persuade, I mean, this is the same as selling. People voluntarily, when you sell something, it's a voluntary exchange. And you're trying to encourage people voluntarily to understand the collective value associated with the individual cost and benefit. And is that, based on the author's interpretation, is that necessarily doable in most cases?
A lot of times not really, because people know that if the one thing better than everyone pitching in and getting to that like utility maximization is everyone pitching in but them, as the chart showed.
Right. Yeah. So unfortunately, it does not lead to optimal results and does not necessarily lead to achieving the desired results, unfortunately. So as a result, we end up with other mechanisms, which of course we know as taxes and subsidies. Taxes are examples of a cost, and subsidies are example of a benefit. But again, they're controlled by government. Taxes in themselves, of course, are coercive. It's a coercive method instead of a persuasive method. Subsidies can be persuasive, but it's still something that the government does to facilitate policy. And those are generally successful. That's why, generally speaking, as we talked about in the introductory example of this book, if we wanted to achieve the greatest impact we could with respect to carbon emissions, using a tax would be the most effective means, because it's coercive, but it's also non-discriminatory. Or generally speaking, non-discriminatory compared to other options. Subsidies have some weaknesses associated. But what are some examples where even with taxes and subsidies, we would not necessarily be successful? For reference, this is starting on page 120, 122.
This is like super small, but like I know they put higher taxes on cigarettes, but people still smoke.
Right. The concern about the social cost and the governmental cost of taking care of people who suffer from the medical ailments associated with cigarettes. We assess taxes not only to recoup those costs, but also with the understanding that hopefully make the cost significant enough that people will choose not to smoke, but it doesn't necessarily change person's behaviors. Correct?
Yeah, kind of like, I mean, I would argue that people who are consistent users, say nicotine products, or consistent drinkers that drink 5 or 6 days out of the week, they're more likely willing to pay those extra taxes, but it's also like they're at the most at risk of using like health facilities because they have liver or lung damage, right? So
Right.
it goes both ways. Like the tax really affects people who might not have the financial ability to keep buying cigarettes, but at the same time, like that's a good thing. But also, we don't want the people to continually abuse this stuff, because that's what actually causes the health issues and the strain on health facilities and services. But
Absolutely. So now we're gonna, okay. I'm sorry, give me just a second. So we're closing out the chapter at this point, and what we're learning is that there is no optimal way to achieve public policy, or very rarely is optimal public policy achieved. And that leads to the theory of the second best. What typically is the second best solution? Thank you, Tira, for your example.
It's the outcome that can be achieved given all the constraints that policymakers can face.
Absolutely. And oftentimes that's the challenge that government faces. It's the reason why, like, let's say, just for an example, that you are a public health person, an immunologist, virologist, epidemiologist, and you want very restrictive measures with respect to responding to COVID. Well, there's going to be a limit on what you can actually achieve. And the reason why is because of these factors that we talk about, such as being able to account for individual action, and the fact that you're not going to necessarily have enough collective support, and working with the various groups associated with it. So you kind of have to accept the theory of the second best alternative, which is what can you do that will be reasonably accepted, because enforcement is more of a challenge with respect to policy than people necessarily realize. Just because government has power doesn't necessarily mean that government can wield it in the way that people think it can wield it. And that's a good thing overall, because it means that government is not necessarily, as oppressive. There's a lot of enforcement that comes from people that are just naturally amenable to just following the law. So you achieve a certain degree with that, but that's not always the case. And there's certainly examples where it goes overboard. So you have to think about, what is it theoretically the government can achieve with its available levers. There's also the concept of these alternative responses that the author talks about in the chapter. What do we mean by altruism?
That's where the author is talking about people, if they decide that they want to have a greater sense of obligation to each other, so that we're all doing everything for the collective best of everyone else.
Right, and you do achieve that in some cases. What's an example where we are able to achieve some social collective results through altruism?
You'll often see it during disasters.
Mhm.
The flooding that took place up in the mountains this past year, and the outpouring of support that people gave.
Right, a lot of times altruism can be achieved work. There is that fact that if you need a tremendous amount of collective response within a given period of time, altruism does satisfy. But if a response or a need extends beyond a certain time frame, it then becomes more of a challenge with respect to altruism, because people naturally direct back to their previous environments. There's also the possibility for private markets to make a contribution. It talks a little bit about how private markets can. Then there is the way that a lot of things are dealt with. And I think there's obviously the role that government plays, but then there's also the role of ongoing relationships and self-organization. And this is outside of formal public sector, whether it be nonprofit or be government action. Next week, we'll talk a little bit more with respect to the prisoner dilemma and talk about we'll go through some examples of that. I did not want to try to do that tonight. But we will definitely talk about the prisoner's dilemma next week. But the fact is that a lot of times in many different cases, and it gives examples, historic cases, but even now, there's a lot of relationships. Like a common example is who mows what part of a people's yard, because property lines aren't necessarily set in stone. They may be set in stone by fences, but if you don't have fences, you have a challenge deciding how much of your yard to mow and how much of your neighbor's yard to mow, particularly and so a lot of times when people mow, they cross over into their neighbor's yard. Well, there seems to be if you've got a good relationship with your neighbor, that's not a problem. So that's kind of the case of an ongoing relationship. You end up mowing each other's yard. So that's something to keep about. And then there's self-organization. People can organize effectively to facilitate solving problems and trying to deal with the externalities associated and the social dilemmas associated with public policy. So what I want to do now, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to break people up into groups. Obviously, y'all have had a chance. Y'all have had a chance to look at this article that I sent, and it's the Monmouth University article, Time to Accept COVID and Move On. It's the results of some polling that they did over the last couple of weeks. They posted it on Monday. And what I would like to do is break y'all up into discussion groups and give y'all about 15 minutes to discuss what you learned from it and applying what you've learned in this chapter. Kind of talk about how are people necessarily behaving and what challenges that creates with respect to dealing with the externalities associated with the pandemic. So give me just a second. I'm going to split y'all up into groups. There will be 4 in each group. So I'm going to do that real quick. So I'm going to give you all 15 minutes and then we will reconvene at 7:33. Okay, thank you all very much. I hope you all enjoyed your all's discussion on this. What I'd like to do is I noticed, I kind of noted the names of some people in each group that hadn't had a chance to go yet. And I kind of want to give, so I'm going to pick out some people specifically. And some of y'all may have discussed a little bit in text, but I want to give y'all a chance to speak if you can. So first of all, I want to go to Ellie. What did y'all think about the article and kind of how it applies to what we discussed tonight?
So regarding vaccines, I'd say obviously there's a lot of positive externalities to the community and people who can't get vaccinated because of they're immunocompromised or something like that. But honestly, I'm a contact tracer, and at this point, there's no prevention measures. It's a 2-day window for after you get infected. There's not much we can do. So if you're vaccinated, that definitely helps, but you're probably still going to get it. And they're predicting that everybody's going to get it. So we were kind of all discussing how this could maybe be slowly getting less severe, slowly becoming more like a cold. But
Right, and that's kind of the medical, the anecdotal response with Omicron seems to be for most people, obviously not all people, seems to be that it's less severe than the previous variants.
yeah, which it kind of is.
Right.
It's like I work for Duke and they're almost completely vaccinated, so it's not that much different from Delta, but everyone is getting it. So it's kind of like eventually there's not going to be any people left, and then hopefully the antibodies are stronger, and then hopefully the next one won't be as bad. But yeah.
Agreed. Understood. So next group, Holly.
Hey, yeah, so in my group, we kind of talked about how it's understandable that like I think everyone's sick of COVID and wants to move on, but the vaccination rates are still troubling, that a lot of a good portion of people are still not vaccinated. So it's difficult to be comfortable with just accepting this reality when a lot of people haven't done their part to stop the spread and end this pandemic. And then we also talked a bit about how in some ways those who are not vaccinated, who are choosing not to be vaccinated, are kind of operating as free riders, because they're utilizing the free testing, and if they were to get sick, they would go to the hospital and use up those resources without doing their part to prevent that in the first place. So we talked about, I think Karen brought up a point about how there's like state employees and other private employees as well, who, if you're not vaccinated, you're required to get tested weekly, which is smart to stop the spread. But then by not being vaccinated and requiring that they get tested and use those free tests, they're using up those resources.
Okay, excellent discussion. Okay, next group, Bree.
I think Bree put it in the chat for you.
Yeah, I see it right now. And I'll just read it. My group talked about how basically the people who haven't gotten it yet probably won't be able to be convinced to get it at this point. And I totally agree with that from what I'm seeing with our employees at the city. We talked about how many people are naturally selfish and because of this make decisions about the vaccine without thinking about how it affects others. So there is definitely some, and Drew, if there's anything you want to add to that.
I was in a different group, but I'm happy to chime in if you're calling on me.
Yeah, you're one of the names I had down, so go ahead.
Okay, sure. Yeah, I also work at Duke like Ellie. And, one thing we were talking about was it's so, there's a trust problem, right? There are things in America that, these foundational ideas of liberty and self-determination, that it's really hard to get people to do things, right? There is no this collective good, like there are in some of these other democracies where they have, much more collective arrangements around their healthcare and, social welfare and whatnot. And so we were talking about how it's super difficult to convince people. They've lost all faith. Like I run an orthopedic surgery practice, and people will walk in the door and just start yelling at us about vaccines and masks. And I'm just here to fix a broken ankle. Like no, we don't even give COVID vaccines.
Right.
And so, it's just one of these things where it's become such a polarized issue, and there's so little trust that it's hard to build that back because there is no collective. It's me, 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 me.
That's definitely one way to look at it. Okay, next up, Lydia.
Yes, so to sort of like say some things that haven't been said yet, we kind of talked about the free rider problem. So people who are not vaccinated are in some ways benefiting from those that are vaccinated. We talked a little bit, we had kind of a debate about public health actually being a public good. So, we weren't sure about that. We were kind of going back and forth there. We also talked about the use of persuasion as a policy intervention that has not worked very well so far. And we even talked a little bit about altruism and how maybe those who have gotten vaccinated are actually doing that to benefit those around them. So those are just some of the things we touched on.
Excellent. And last but not least, Jessica. Jessica.
Jessica was in our group and didn't necessarily say anything, but I can speak on behalf of her.
Okay, go ahead.
We basically talked about what everyone else did as well, especially the free rider problem, but we also went into diffused and concentrated interests, and we talked about how that small, like 25% of Americans who haven't got vaccinated but don't necessarily feel strongly one way or another about COVID are being persuaded by those who do have really concentrated interests, whether those are positive or negative. And so we just like
Positive
talked
or
about
negative
how
on the positive or
like
negative on the vaccine.
yes, so like there are groups
Okay.
that obviously like have a very concentrated like my negative like interest in it, and then there's also those who feel like very strongly positively about it, and so those concentrated interests might be working altogether negatively to negatively impact the diffused individuals who make up that haven't gotten vaccinated yet group,
Okay.
if that makes
Does
sense.
anybody, absolutely. Does anybody else want to add anything?
One,
I-
oh, go ahead.
Okay, go ahead, Cynthia.
Thanks. I was going to add that I think much of this article is focusing around this frustration with the amount of time we've been dealing with COVID. And I think regardless of whichever side of that coin you feel about vaccines, it's just too long for everybody. Like this is too long to tolerate this drastic situation in life. And the very interesting thing is like there's very limited ways to make that length of time change other than waiting it out. I feel like now is because the individuals that are making that self-interested decision to make a personal choice, which they do have the right to make that personal choice, of course, not actually seeing the longer impact. Like the people who've chosen not to get vaccinated, who are still not vaccinated as of today, like well over 2 years into this pandemic, which is so sad to say out loud. But yeah, we're like well over 2 years, and they won't be convinced by what they're seeing. So I don't think we're at a stage where they can be persuaded by the government. I don't think they're at a place where they have much faith in it changing, because when people were a lot more hopeful like a year ago, when people were getting vaccinated, thinking that there would be a lot more change, but then seeing all these variants pop up, it really contributes to this like lack of hope overall, which sounds depressing, but like I do think that's an issue because there's nothing to motivate right now individuals to get vaccinated, because I think the people who are waiting for proof are seeing variants and getting more frustrated, or people who are like more on their decision for wanting to not get vaccinated, it being more like an individual choice thing, like they're not going to budge, because if they wanted to, they would have by now, because I do think the government has already invested time, money, resources, and also expanding locations in which to get vaccines, to make it as easy as possible to get tested, now more than ever. That wasn't done as early as it should have, in my opinion, but that's kind of like we've never dealt with this before. So like we're all just kind of dealing with it as we go along. So I do think people who are vaccinated are still frustrated because they're like, I did my part, but COVID's not gone. This is so annoying. And I feel like that's a fair viewpoint to have, because the time in which everyone is dealing with it, regardless of your vaccination choice, everyone's dealing with it for the same amount of time.
Okay, excellent thoughts, and I can definitely see what you're saying, and I'm going to be honest. My experience looking at history with respect to public policy, I'm surprised that we haven't gotten to full uprising at this point, because my initial feeling was we may have had at most 90 days to be able to facilitate any kind of societal response of any kind of mitigation which directly affects people's lives on a daily basis. And I'll be honest, and granted, we live in North Carolina. I think everybody here lives in North Carolina. And North Carolina is not New York, it's not New Jersey, it's not like not California, it's not like some of the other states who've taken a more extreme stance in terms of where things are, and especially where things are now. I mean, you look at what's going on in DC or those types of things. and I agree with the last comment about, hard to keep anything in the public eye for a long enough time, and that's absolutely true. But I'll be very honest, I'm surprised that we as a society have been as tolerant as we are to the point where it creates habit. And I've seen this with respect to droughts and water management. I've seen it with respect to other things. There's a tendency for people to become creatures of habit, and we certainly have started to see that, depending on your personal views with respect to the pandemic. And we realize that there are differing views in terms of that. And Tira is right. Non-compliance, some of that can be tried to a general mistrust in the government overall, and generally that's been an accepted practice. And particularly, it is in a generally free society. I want to be clear to preface that, but the reality is that compliance, those who adopt habits, it becomes their habit. And so as people mask, for example, if you are somebody there, I don't want to speak for anybody here, I'm just basing it off observation. If you mask regularly, the tendency is that you become much more comfortable with that. You become habitually tied to it. If you're somebody who doesn't, you become more habitually tied to not wearing one. Same is true with vaccines. And if your view is, particularly because there's this aspect of natural immunity, which our public health experts, and I'm going to say this is a weakness of what they've said. They have not done a very good job of explaining why on an individual level, natural immunity is not enough. And I will say that, because the fact is, somebody can sit there with COVID and say, I've had COVID, why should I get the vaccine? I'm not saying other people should get the vaccine, but why should I get it? And what we can say is, well, because it's a mutated virus and because it does change, you may get it again. And those cases do happen. But there's a lot of factors involved, and I think y'all did an excellent job in terms of that. And obviously, like I said again, it's a lot different than it is in some other places. And I want to read. Right. I mean, and Melissa, you make some good points. So I appreciate everybody taking some time to think about this. I hope it was a thoughtful discussion, and I think it tied very well to our discussion of externalities for the course of this session tonight. So now we're going to talk about next week. Next week, it is chapters 5 and 6 that we will be discussing. Chapter 5, excuse me just one second. I should know this off the top of my head, but I don't. Chapter 5 deals with coordination problems, and chapter 6 deals with commitment problems. There are some videos that I have put in the week 5 document that I encourage you to look at. I will also tomorrow morning send out the course reading and lecture assignment number 1, and it'll be due by 6 p.m. next Thursday. So that'll be sent by email tomorrow morning. Excuse me, if your group has not already selected your topics, please do so as soon as possible. These are first come, first serve. I sent an email with the topic listing before, so please provide your top 3. The deadline for topic selection is 8:45 next week. And next week I will go over what the project will entail. So I will make sure to go over that next week when we discuss the projects. Are there any other questions at this point? Okay. Well, thank you all very much for your participation and for your discussion. I greatly appreciate it, and I look forward to talking to you all again next week. Please take care and have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.